Someone writes a $195 billion check at the border, and it is not the exporter. If you blame the foreign seller for that price bump, you are misreading the one receipt that actually moves. The word tariff hides two things: who actually signs for it and how that cost sneaks onto your shelf. Most people picture a foreign country paying a fine. That picture is wrong. By the end, you will trace this money from the port to the store, and know the two jobs a tariff is quietly trying to do at once. Start at the water's edge. A shipment can't leave the port until someone pays the import tax on it. Break time equals 0, 6 is slash. Here's the part that surprises people. The one legally on the hook is the importer of record. That's the domestic buyer or consignee bringing the goods in, not the foreign seller. That domestic importer is responsible for the duty when the shipment enters the country, before the goods are released. Picture it plainly. The container lands. Customs won't hand it over until the tax is settled. So the importer or someone acting for them pays U.S. Customs and Border Protection right there at clearance. Who physically writes it? Usually a freight forwarder or a customs broker. They are the paperwork specialists a company hires to move goods across the border. They pay customs on the importer's behalf, then bill the importer back. So the check clears fast, often within about 10 business days of the goods entering. One number to hold on to: the container does not move until that duty is paid. That's the first link in the chain, and it's a domestic company's name on it. But if the domestic buyer pays at the border, why do so many people still say the exporting country foots the bill? Here's where the myth breaks. When a country puts a tariff on imports, that tax is not mailed to the foreign government. There is no bill sent overseas. The domestic importer pays their own government directly. The U.S. company bringing goods in pays the import tax straight to the U.S. Treasury. The exporting country is never invoiced. Break time equals 0, 6 is slash. Sit with that for a second. The money that a tariff raises comes out of a domestic bank account, not a foreign one. That is the core mechanic, and it's why the exporting country pays is simply wrong at the point of collection. The foreign seller may feel effects later. We'll get to that, but the check at the border has a domestic name on it every single time. So if a domestic company is the one paying, does that company just quietly eat the cost? Almost never. It starts moving, and where that cost goes next is where it finally reaches you. Now follow the cost forward. The tariff behaves like an extra cost stapled to the goods at the border. And like any cost, it looks for somewhere to go. The importer has 3 doors. They can swallow it and take a thinner profit. They can push back on the foreign seller for a lower price. Or they can pass it up the chain. Watch that third door because it's the common one. The importer marks up their price to the wholesaler to cover the duty. The wholesaler marks up their price to the retailer. The retailer sets the shelf price with a little margin added at each stop. So a tax paid once at the water's edge can arrive at the register slightly larger than it started. Everyone in between prices to protect their own cut. That's the travel path in one line: border, then wholesaler, then shelf. The tariff didn't teleport to your receipt. It walks there one markup at a time. Which raises the obvious question: if the cost lands on domestic buyers, does the foreign exporter ever pay any of it at all? Yes, sometimes. A foreign exporter staring at a lost sale can cut its own price to stay competitive. If the tariff makes their goods too expensive, they might shave their asking price so the final shelf cost barely moves. In effect, the exporter eats part of the tax to keep the customer. It's real and it does happen. But how often? Break time equals 0, 6 is slash. Here's the number that settles the argument. According to New York Fed research on the 2025 tariffs, nearly 90% of the economic burden fell on U.S. firms and consumers, not on foreign exporters. So the exporter absorbing the cost is the minority case, not the rule. Roughly 9 out of every $10 of that burden stayed home. Now that share isn't frozen. Later in 2025, foreign exporters did start absorbing a growing slice as they fought to hold on to buyers. But the headline held: the domestic side carried the large majority. So the exporter just eats it isn't a myth. It's an exception. And that exception matters most when the other country decides to hit back. Here's where it turns into a fight. When one country slaps a tariff on imports, the other often hits back. It puts its own tariffs on the first country's exports. That's retaliation, and it flips the pain around. Now the first country's exporters are the ones facing a wall. Take a concrete case. China put duties on U.S. soybeans, and exports to that market fell sharply. Suddenly, American soybean farmers had crops and far fewer buyers. When exporters get squeezed like that, governments sometimes step in to cushion the hit. In December 2025, the USDA made $12 billion in one-time bridge payments available to U.S. farmers caught in the crossfire. That's a lot of money aimed at one wound. But notice what just happened. A tax meant to raise money at one border ended up costing the government a payout at another. Retaliation doesn't cancel a tariff. It multiplies where the bill shows up. Which leads to the real question under all of this: what is a tariff even trying to accomplish? So what's the point of the whole thing? A tariff is quietly trying to do two jobs at once, and they pull in opposite directions. Job 1, protect a domestic industry. Make imports pricier so homegrown producers can compete. Job 2, raise revenue for the government. Now watch why those two fight. If a tariff is so high that it blocks imports completely, great protection, then almost nothing crosses the border. So it collects almost no tax. And if goods keep pouring in and paying the duty, you're raising plenty of revenue. But you're not really shielding the domestic industry from the flood. That's the built-in tension. You can protect hard or you can raise a lot of money. But a single tariff struggles to do both at full strength. And in 2025, the revenue job showed up loud. The federal government collected roughly $195 billion in customs duties in fiscal year 2025. The same $195 billion check from the very start. That was more than 250% of the prior year's haul. Say that again, over 2.5 times what it pulled in the year before. That much money crossing the counter tells you a lot of goods were still flowing and paying, which is exactly why the protection job and the revenue job can never both win at once. So here's the full trail, start to finish. A domestic importer writes the check at the border, often through a broker before the goods move. That cost walks up the chain, importer to wholesaler to shelf, gaining a markup at each stop. Foreign exporters absorb some of it, but the New York Fed found roughly 90% stayed on U.S. firms and consumers. Retaliation can flip the pain to exporters and trigger aid like that $12 billion. And the whole tool is torn between protecting an industry and raising the $195 billion it raised. So what do companies actually do to soften the blow? Some park goods in a foreign trade zone. That's a fenced-off spot where duty waits until goods enter the market to delay paying. Some spread sourcing to Vietnam or India instead of one country, a move called China +1. Some carefully recheck how a product is classified and where its origin counts. And some move factories closer to home. Every one of those is a cost and a bet, not a magic escape. Here's the one thing to carry out of this. When you hear that a country got hit with a tariff, remember who actually signed the check. A domestic importer at your own border before the goods ever moved. And remember where the cost mostly landed. About $9 out of $10 of it on buyers and firms at home, not overseas. Next time a headline says a foreign country is paying, you'll know to ask one quiet question. Paying whom and at which border? That single question tells you more than the headline does. So the short version, the check is written at the border by a domestic buyer and the cost mostly lands right here at home. If tracing a hidden bill like this clicks for you, you'll love watching how a shipping container itself became the machine that quietly rebuilt global trade. This is information, not financial advice. Do your own research.